Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on April 20th, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. And the most important news comes, of course, from the ocean and the United States of America, where the law on military assistance to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan and other allies has already passed the first stage of voting. 316 votes in favor and only 94 against. Next week, there will be a repeat vote, in my opinion, in the Senate, and after that in Congress, more precisely. After that the law will be sent to Joe Biden for signature. In other words, the law will most likely be signed next week. There is an extremely high probability that Republicans and Democrats have found a compromise. And in general, information is being received that a package for these 90-something billion dollars is already ready. And everything has already been stored, everything is ready in boxes, delivery routes have already been developed. In other words, it is only necessary to sign, and within 2 weeks, in the coming weeks, first aid. First weapons will begin to cross the border and enter the territory of Ukraine. In other words, everything will be fast and efficient enough. But in general, if we talk about this situation, then of course, Ukraine has always received military assistance. Literally on a daily basis, it publishes in a daily, let's say, rhythm mode. Footage of crossing the border of the next batch of military equipment is published, but this is apparently such current assistance. Repair and service are possible, movement is possible back and forth from one side the other one. But it is precisely after the signing of the law that a large flow of weapons is once again coming here to Ukraine. And of course, the main reason for the next flow of weapons is, first of all, the problem on the front line. Because we see that Ukraine is being defeated both at Belogorsk-Kavka, despite the difficulties at Seversk, the Hour in Yar, Avdiivka direction, Novomykhailovskoy, and the possible opening of another front somewhere in the Kharkiv region. By the way, today, for example, Mi-6 transmitted information to Zelensky that by the end of May, the Russian Federation is leading into battle an additional 10 formed brigades with new weapons, with new equipment absolutely. Production of the 24th, 23rd years, and with new weapons. And where exactly it will enter is not clear, but it is all this fuss of Western countries that suggests that they may have received some. They clearly realized some intelligence information, and realized that without the help of Ukraine, it simply would not withstand another blow. And everything would collapse there. And now we need to saturate as much as possible, despite the problems, let's say, a general contradiction. An internal contradiction. Ukraine needs to be helped in their opinion, in order to prevent collapse and prevent a tragedy. Well, let's go back to the line of contact now. Let's start with you from the Kharkiv region. Today, footage of another strike with the use of the Iskander missile defense system in the area of the settlement of White Well has been published. So far, information about the strikes has not been received, but some point of temporary dislocation was probably destroyed. Of interest, it is also worth paying attention to the summary of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, which was published today. Either the Ministry of Defense is trolling everyone again and trying to make fun of those who follow the summary, or something really incomprehensible is happening. But if you go back to the summary of the Ministry of Defense, analyze it, then today you will not see one very important point there. For example, on all days, in all the reports that have been published for the last 6 months or a year until today, April 20th, any summary was formed according to the following principle: the direction, the group of troops, and the results of activities. Then today there were reports. Absolutely all directions were removed. That is, a summary of the grouping of troops west, grouping of troops south, center, without direction is being conducted. Let's say, it used to be in the Georgian direction, the grouping of troops is such. That is, the direction was removed. Again, that is whether this trolling, or it really will be another formatting of the line of directions of movement in the near future. And the inclusion in the battle of the northern grouping of troops north is difficult to say. But for sure the Russian army, the Ministry of Defense is preparing for something. In the Kapinsky direction, another news was received about the destruction of another bridge, which is simply destroyed here, in my opinion, every month. But perhaps another crossing was built, and now the Russian army destroyed the bridge between Sinkova and Kruglikhovka. In general, the operational pause continues in the Kopensky direction. No actions, geolocations have been observed in this direction for a long period of time. The main forces are now concentrated on the Donetsk, Avdiivka, and South Donetsk directions. To the north, the armed forces of the Russian Federation went back into the groove in front of Bologorovka, so it has not been possible to take it yet. No matter how many times they stormed it, all attempts were stopped by counterstrikes in the forest using drones. At the moment, there is a regrouping and most likely a rethinking in the direction. Perhaps attempts to develop a strike in another place, somewhere in the Verkhnekamiansky district. Today, footage was published of strikes by multiple launch rocket systems or flamethrower systems of the Sun on the support point, which we discussed with you a few days ago, weeks ago, perhaps. We remember with you the footage of how the Russian fighters cleaned this stronghold and now. But we have not painted the terrain maps yet, not understanding whether it was finally cleaned up, or it was just a reconnaissance by combat, after which the Russian attack aircraft then went to the original ones. And today, footage of a strike using multiple launch rocket systems is being published. These shots most likely indicate that, after all, this support is still under the control of the AFU. And perhaps after repeated artillery training, the assault itself will begin in the near future, and perhaps after that, we will be able to paint this area under the color of the control of the Russian army. In the South Seversky direction, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to clear out strong points, defensive lines, defensive fortifications along the Bologorov-Kvyemko railway without any active actions on the ground. Now I have a similar situation. The Russian army, let's say in short, if we approach this direction, has run into another line of defense, mainly located at altitudes, starting from the settlement, let's say Grigorovka, and south to Ivanovsky itself. All the positions of the AFU are located exclusively at altitudes, on, let's say, natural elevations which are very difficult to storm. The Russian army is not in a hurry to storm them yet, since in general there is a high risk of ending the operation with colossal losses. So there is a gradual processing of the direction by striking positions with the use of the same anti-tank weapons. On, say, rotation vehicles, evacuation vehicles are being hit with artillery, bombs arrive, multiple launch rocket systems arrive. Missiles and in general, as it were, a sweep is underway. In general, this quarter in Yara resembles, first of all, to some extent, even Ugledar. I remind you that during the 3 years of the war, during these years, the Russian army did not manage to get close to him. And the thing is, it's because of the high-rise buildings and the height at which the settlement itself is located. In general, the situation here is almost the same, although some sources almost daily assure that today it was possible to advance another 100 meters there, and so on. Most likely, progress is underway, however, I repeat, the movement is very slow, it is very difficult to give every meter. And it is very difficult to give another square kilometer, due to the fact that a significant amount of reserves were transferred here in the forest, and the situation was generally stabilized. However, in the near future, we should definitely expect breakthrough news from the Chasiver direction. Very interesting news is also received from the settlements of Novgorodskoye, Dzerzhinskaya, Torets, New York. As it is convenient for you, the Russian army has become very active in this area. Let me remind you that the center group of troops is working here, that is, the Avdiivka direction, according to the old classification. If nothing changes, and the Avdiivka direction will continue, we see strikes with the use of ARBC 500ths, and this is if we increase the number of updates from the 1st of April. Then we will be able to see in general whether the Russian fighters worked quite closely this month, mainly with ARBC 500ths. And perhaps in the near future they will try to probe the defense of the AFU in this direction as well. And the thing is that at the moment, despite the fact that the overall situation has stabilized, and, more precisely, has not stabilized, but the progress of the advance of the Russian army has been minimized on a daily basis in the North Avdiivka direction. Despite the fact that the advanced detachments have already entered Novokalinova, it has still become quite difficult to advance further. They brought all the incapacitated brigades to the issue, replaced them with more or less combat-ready and motivated. And now the Russian army is essentially doing the same thing in Novokalinov and in ceramics that is being done in Semenovka. And in the same Berdik, Novomikhailovka settlements are leveled with the ground using all those possible types of weapons. Perhaps in the near future, there will be attempts to move further towards the northern outskirts of Karamik, but now we have what we have. According to Osheredin, the situation here is also not the most favorable for the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russian army continues to advance in the southern, let's say, part in the direction of the southwest. Today, some cartographers, including the pro-Ukrainian cartographers of Deep State, have updated their map, showing that there is indeed progress, even if not so significant, but it is there. Then the footage was published by various, let's say, alters and sources on the ground about strikes on Russian positions. That is, there is progress. At the same time, separately pro-Ukrainian sources report that, let's say, over the past day, the Russian army has managed to advance 100 meters of Novokalinov, 100 meters along the Napravnik of Novobakhmutovka, 100 meters in Novomikhailovka, 200 meters in Krasnogorskovka, 100 meters more in Bogdanovka, another 200 meters somewhere northwest of Victory. That is, there is a constant promotion in small chunks, but as if these are not the promotions that promise some kind of grandiose breakthrough. It's a difficult, hard job. Berdik. The fighting for the settlement continues. In theory, the 47th Brigade is still standing here tightly, although some shots are already being published. That strikes are being carried out on the very last positions of the AFU. And let's say some sources report that after this massive blow was delivered, Russian troops rushed into settlements and secured exactly the area where they were striking. That is, well, the days are numbered, but you may still have to count them. In other words, the Berdiks seem to have come to the very, very final stage, but the Ukrainians are also resisting. There are no changes at all in the Yasnobrodovsky direction. After the Russian army established full control over Pervomaiskaya, over Pervomaisky during this week, the movement in the direction of Ney-Taylova-Yasnobrodov-Kalmanskaya stopped, or acquired some kind of positional and character, or at the level of statistical transgression, that is, small. At the same time, the Russian army, according to most sources, is currently focused on cutting off the artillery pocket between Novolsky and Pervomaisky itself. More and more cartographers, including about the Ukrainian diptate, show that something is really going on here. If the Russian cartographer assures that these fields with a support are located between Pervomaisky and Novolsky, already under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, then Ukrainian sources treat this direction more calmly, claiming that this area is under question, perhaps it is in a gray zone. However, most experts and analysts, and those who have some sources, say from the area, report that the APU has already withdrawn the entire garrison from this package. Perhaps there are some Arigad troops left there, which may collapse and, in principle, give them the opportunity to surrender, since they may not have been soiled anywhere and were not highlighted there anywhere. And then we go with you to Krasnogorovka. After literally a pause in one day, the Russian army found a weak gap in the defense of the armed forces of Ukraine, found a weak spot where it is best to strike, and today they practiced this square during the day. As you can see, the square is located between the eastern fortified area and, say, the central refractory plant. It was on the line between these two pillars that the Russian army today worked with the use of multiple launch rocket systems, flamethrowers, and drones. We see with you the focus and density of working out. In other words, most likely after such a massive, say, artillery preparation, the Russian troops will try to move in this direction. Try to move in this way somehow. And the main task will be for the next few days, it is to align the front line and establish control, perhaps approximately over such terrain. In other words, this will allow the Russian troops to come closer to the fortification of the APU, located in eastern Krasnogorovka. it is possible to collapse or force the APU to begin retreating from this direction, that is. Since in fact there will already be a call to the rear, and most importantly, in addition to entering the rear, Russian troops will be able to come close to the positions of the APU located in high-rise buildings. This is one of the most basic fortifications and, let's say, strong points of the APU in this direction. And in case of reaching the distance of a short strike, the control of the terrain itself will already begin, as well as some kind of positional struggle against, let's say. And in order to prevent the APU from using all the advantages of this terrain efficiently, there is, well, perhaps it will be possible to somehow level the front line. Perhaps open some window of opportunity for moving in this direction from Donetsk in the direction of Krasnogorskavka. In other words, here the Russian army is gradually shifting to the east, from the southeast, specifically to the east. So far, we see the plant with you, based on geolocation. It was decided to bypass it, including from the eastern side. But the Russian army is trying to manipulate and maneuver in some way further. The advance of the Russian army is marked along Georgiivka. Some cartographers, including the pro-Ukrainian one, publish that they managed to take a network of supports between George and Kai Pobeda, and according to the latest data. If we summarize everything, at the moment the Russian army controls approximately, according to individual cartographers, such an area. Significant progress, significant successes. The main thing is that the network of support points located in the fields under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. And now relying on these support points, it is easy to finish, in fact, the St. George offensive operation, and take at least half of the settlement finally and irrevocably under control, and go out to, let's say, mortar fire on Maximiliivka. That is, to shift the focus further to the west and so on. According to the new Mikhailovka, as you can see, we have updated the map. Today, some separate information has already begun to arrive, separate sources, that a decision has been made on Novomikhailovka to take a short break for 2 days, 2 or 3 days, in order to make sure that take some small pause between events, and when these events will be published online. But it is reported that most likely there is an extremely high probability that Novomikhailovka is completely under the control of the Russian army, that the last strongholds were knocked out of the last positions in the western part of the Sum. But why is this information not published? Because most likely there is still a possibility and risks of counterstrikes from the APU. And if these counterstrikes are carried out successfully, they can again enter populated areas. Then no matter how much I don't want to present this information in advance, let's say. But again, of the interesting things, it is worth paying attention to the statistics that were published by the 79th Brigade, the Armobile Brigade, the Air Assault Brigade. In these frames, they seem to show the entire chronology of the 6-month battle for the settlement. He is sure, it is claimed that it was 6 months that the battle for the settlement of Novomikhailovka took place. One of the bloodiest, most brutal, hardest and darkest battles that were fought during the entire special military operation. Of course, we can say that Bakhmut, Artemev and Avdiivka had complicated operations there. In my understanding, Novomikhailovka was no less than a seemingly simple village. It would seem that there are 1 or 2 brigades from the APU, there are several brigades from the Russian army. But the Ukrainians calculated that 314 pieces of equipment of the armed forces of the Russian Federation were destroyed in 6 months of the war, in 6 months of hostilities. These are tanks, Beks, there may be some simple passenger cars and others. 314 pieces of equipment. Here is this map. Here we see with you in the last frames, in fact, every point where there was an explosion of destruction. And in general, according to these frames, you can see how far and deeply the Russian fighters managed to go during this time. Perhaps the 79th published a frame of this battle with Novomikhailev in order to sweeten the pills for people. Yes, that's right. Let's say we lost in the 79th, but in 6 months of the war, we inflicted, let's say, enough such critical damage. 314 pieces of equipment. That's a lot. That's a lot of 314 pieces of equipment. Here is a story about Novomikhailivka. We are waiting for official confirmations, after which we will already think about what will happen next. Ugledar for a few days was the first day when nothing came from the direction, the South Donetsk direction, to the Roman tactical bridgehead. After a short pause of just a few days, the Russian army resumed fighting on the southern outskirts of the harvest. Multiple launch rocket systems, aircraft, bombs, mortars began to fall into the sun again. Everything flew on a large scale, precisely in the southern part of the harvest, on farms. Perhaps artillery training is being conducted before further offensive actions. It is very likely that after such powerful strikes, the Russian army will try to do something. Literally move 200, 300, 400 meters further north along the farms and in general. As we discussed in previous videos, the main task of the Russian army is to get on the road, say, connecting them, which previously connected the settlement of Staromayorskaya and Harvest. That is, in fact, to reach the center of the settlement. If it succeeds, then it turns out to be in a semicircle according to Staromayorsky. And then there will already be fighting in parallel for the second settlement. In other words, a powerful preparation is underway. In the near future, we should expect a possible intensification of hostilities. The work direction remains unchanged. Individual sources report on the promotion. In my opinion, the APU has managed to carry out more or less some kind of rotation over the past few days. Despite the high losses, new fresh forces managed to bring and gain a foothold, and this suggests that everything in the work begins from the very beginning. It is very important in offensive operations in small groups, such as the Rabachi operation, to successfully catch, let's say, an opponent on rotation. And here it did not happen, or it happened, but not enough, and, accordingly, fresh forces re-entered the north and northeast. Despite this, it suggests that in the near future, we should not expect breakthroughs again in 2 or 3 weeks. There will be again the same story that we have seen before. Russian sources report that Ukrainian sources generally confirm that massive missile strikes were carried out on the settlement of Zaporozhye and on the settlement of Dnipropetrovsk in the last day. Serious damage has been done, destroyed. Separately, they publish footage of those blows that were inflicted earlier and the results of the blows. That is, for the second or third day in a row, strikes are being carried out on the locality. We see the complete absence of any resistance or air defense from the APU. Everything is equal, logistics, warehouses, and production are being destroyed. In particular, information is being published about a massive strike on the Odessa region, and today, the last day. Mainly strikes were inflicted on Grigorovka, Bilyari, on New Bellers, and so on and so forth. This is a small bay, estuary more precisely. Here we see with you where and specifically the blows were struck. We see with you on containers that can be used for storing fuel or something else. And in the course of the defeat, these tanks were set on fire, let's say, and some sources report that they burned for several days. Well, more precisely, the second day continues to burn. It turns out the tanks, they have not been extinguished so far. Most likely, these were fuel tanks, but at the moment, of course, it is not very pleasant to lose tanks before possible operations or possible actions in this direction. Also, sources report that the Ukrainian armed forces have more precisely, let's say, introduced more precisely. The French have already introduced 1,000 French fighters on the territory of Odessa. Now they are quartered in the Odessa region, and in the near future, it is reported about the next batch of Frenchmen who will come to Odessa. That is, perhaps up to 2,000 garrisons will be here. And this, of course, will first of all allow Ukrainians to free up some of the resources from Odessa and transfer them to other directions. Well, 2,000 of course is a shot for an elephant, yes, but in any case, if those 5,000 Frenchmen or some kind of combined contingent are transferred here, then the 5,000 brigade will be transferred somewhere to the front line. This would probably help Ukraine to stabilize the situation for a while, which is developing as much as possible not in its favor. At the same time, it is worth paying attention to the posts of information that comes from the Russian Federation. Let me remind you that in the near future we will return, again, the topic of military assistance. They are going to provide it. And the main source of funding in this case will be Russian assets, which have most likely been written off. And most likely have decided to finally say goodbye to them. And they are used to transfer Ukraine or finance operations in Ukraine. But despite all this, the Russian industry continues to build and produce new types of weapons, drones, tanks, in large quantities. Mass production. And so far, no one in the world can cope with the volume, quality, and quantity of weapons produced, like the Russian Federation.